The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. On the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark, and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we do not know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloth there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. For they did not yet understand the scripture, that he had to rise from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord. People seem to enjoy a comeback story. There is something inspiring about the accounts of those who succeed against the odds in the fight against adversity. Those of you who are Patriots fans recall the thrill of Super Bowl 51, when after going up by a field goal to start the game, the Patriots, down by 4 touchdowns to Atlanta, rallied back with 4 late scores to win the game in overtime. Perhaps the greatest victory in Patriots football, even Tom Brady called that game, quote, the defining moment in a professional career. Or spring is here. Think baseball. The 2004 Red Sox, down 3-0 to the Yankees in the American League Championship. The Sox surprised everyone by winning 4 straight games en route to their first World Series championship since what? World War I? One sports writer called the result the ultimate underdog story meets baseball magic. Sports stories are fun, but personal stories of comebacks are the more compelling. Nelson Mandela endured imprisonment for 27 years, but persevered and emerged as his country's first president in what I wouldn't call a peaceful, but at least a managed transfer of power. Or Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, was once fired from the very company he founded, only to be later asked to return, where he developed something that nearly everyone in this church has on his or her person right now, myself included, the iPhone. Or consider one less well known, Ramona Pearson, probably not a name that any of you recognize. Ramona Pearson was a 22-year-old algorithm specialist for the Marine Corps, hit one night by a drunk driver, and left in a coma for 18 months. That accident broke 104 of Pearson's bones, caused multiple forms of brain trauma, and punctured holes in her lungs. When she woke up in a hospital, a year and a half later, she weighed 64 pounds, had metal bones in her face and a body still covered in scars, and that wasn't the worst part. Perhaps worse yet, she could not see. The accident left her blind. After her time in the hospital, Pearson had no family to help her with long-term recovery. She found refuge in a long-term assisted care facility for senior citizens. Now imagine for a moment going into a coma as a young 20-something, coming out of it blind, in living your life in a old folks home, still in your 20s. But her neighbors, the senior citizens, took her on as their project, and she credits them and their regular conversations with ultimately teaching her to speak conversationally again, to cook, and to dress herself. And when her sight returned in her early 30s, 11 years after the accident, she joined the USA Paralympic team, got a doctorate in neuroscience, and later went on to lead data innovation for one of the Big Four accounting firms. The resurrection. The resurrection is a comeback story, complete with rejection, imprisonment, broken bones and blood, a loss of hope, and a surprising change in outcome against incredible odds. But the resurrection is a comeback story not for Christ only, but for all of creation. The resurrection story is a comeback tale, not for Christ only, but for all of creation. And to understand why, we have to consider the tragedy that got it started. And I don't mean Holy Week or the Passion. Adam and Eve are not historical figures in the way that we understand history, but what they represent is human rejection of a balanced world gifted to humanity by its Creator. The world that we know now is plagued. The world that we know now is plagued by a wicked paradox. The wicked paradox is this: from the moment that one begins living, one likewise begins to die. From the moment one begins living, one likewise gets closer to death. Every moment alive from the cradle, brings you closer to no longer being alive. Now, we take that for granted because it's all that we know. But consider for a moment how cruel and even irrational it is that life leads to death. What is the alternative, you might ask? That life should lead to more life. That's what's described in the opening pages of Genesis. What is described in Genesis is that life was supposed to develop into heavenly life. Life was supposed to lead to more life, a fuller life, without boundaries, once we were capable, so that with each moment we would grow more alive and not 1 minute closer to dying. But something went wrong, and what precisely it was we cannot know, but it wasn't hunger that tripped up Adam and Eve. The serpent tempts her not with taste, but with the promise that if you eat the forbidden fruit, you will be like gods. That was the temptation, that you will be like gods. That's the point of the Genesis story. The ancient serpent slithers up to the woman and says, "Surely your disobedience will not lead to your death. Rather, you will know good and evil, and you will be like gods." The first humans, what caused the fracture was the attempt to seize divinity away from God himself. Now, there was, as of yet, no death. There was no death in the garden. The man and woman were alive. Everything in the garden was infused with life. Death meant only the opposite of everything that was around them. They wouldn't have known what God meant when he said that they could die. They would know death only as an opposite. They had not yet tasted it. Death is not God's creation. In fact, death is not a creation at all. Death is simply the absence of life. Death is simply the absence of life. And the point of Genesis is that death is what flows from humanity's no to God. Death is a symptom, of humanity's refusal to trust the very Creator who handed them the world. And for that reason, the world, and here I mean everything, from the individual to the environment, the world has been dealt a significant setback. Christ's resurrection is the beginning of a comeback. Not a personal comeback for a man who lived over 2,000 years, but the beginning, just the beginning of a comeback for all of creation. Christ's resurrection is the awakening from an ages-long coma. The entire Judeo-Christian tradition has been predicting this comeback from the fall. The entire Judeo-Christian tradition has been predicting this comeback from the fall. That's what the Old Testament is. In the Old Testament, Isaiah, the prophet, writes, "See, I am creating a new heavens and a new earth, where the former things shall not be remembered." In the New Testament, Peter tells us in his second letter that we await new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And then finally in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, the visionary author declares that in the final age, he sees emerging a new heaven and a new earth, and Christ seated on the throne saying, "Behold, I make all things new." The recovery, though, is not a one-time event. Those of you who have ever gone through recovery know that all too well. Christ's resurrection was the awakening and the beginning of an ages-long comeback that we are still experiencing. One that is not without considerable struggle, like Pearson in the senior care facility, learning to speak again, to dress again, and to see. And that recovery embraces the whole world, where the vitality of life, the vitality of every life will once again be restored to all creation, and decay will finally have its cure. That's why Christians, and Catholics in particular, place such special emphasis on the body after death. For those taking part in the recovery, death will not be the last word. We will one day be restored, body and soul, to the state that God had intended. There are obstacles to our recovery, to be sure. Stones that must be rolled away from the tomb. Perhaps the heaviest stones are not those that afflict the body, but those that terrorize the soul. Especially those that weaken our faith in the very possibility of such a grand recovery. Here I cannot help but notice the pun available with the word comeback. There are some of you who find it unappealing for various reasons to grace the inside of a church every Sunday, or even to stay to the end once you arrive. Easter is your call to return. You must come back to be part of the comeback. Now, I must confess to you that I am neither a Pats nor a Red Sox fan. My sympathies lie further west in Pittsburgh, to the part of the country that first made me a player in this comeback saga. But I will tip my hat to Super Bowl 51 and to the 2004 season for how both signify, in however faint a way, the exhilaration that awaits those of us who celebrate this day with faith. Christ's resurrection was something like that first hit, that necessary third down conversion. Or more seriously, that first breath of fresh, free air that first step forward on your own feet after an accident, or a streak of cloudy light that signals the return of sight. That spark that gets the whole comeback started, that is the resurrection. We can be part of that story. But chances are, for all of us, there are stones that must be removed. Before we leave, consider in this Mass what those obstacles are for you, the stones that must be removed for you to come out and be part of the comeback. Every Easter is a call to come back. Look around and survey the cave and remove the stone from the still ever-shrinking tomb that closes in on your present life. I will not ever free a nation. I'm not going to invent the next iPhone. And most regrettably, I'm not tall enough to quarterback a Super Bowl winning team. And although I've never tried, I'm pretty certain that I can't hit a ball out of Fenway. But despite the odds, we can do much more, so much more, in playing our part in the greatest comeback story in the history of the world.